Here we have the CompleteFTP Manager open for the Professional Edition. Like the Standard Edition, we have an overview, we have a Protocols panel, Users and Folders. And you can inspect the properties of the folders or the users by pressing the little tab there. In the Professional Edition, though, you'll notice that compared to the Standard Edition, there are extra protocols. We still have FTP, FTPS, and implicit FTPS, and SFTP. But we now have SCP, also known as Secure Copy. We have SSH Forwarding and SSH Terminal. We also have HTTPS and HTTP. And finally, file sharing. These are all additional protocols that are supported in the Professional Edition. We'll explore those a little bit further on. We add a user and add folders in exactly the same way as we did in the Standard Edition. I'll just quickly demonstrate adding a virtual folder. I'm going to call this one temp. Got a virtual folder called temp. I need to apply the changes. This virtual folder does not point to any directory on the actual hard disk of the PC that this is running on. To do that, what I can do is add a Windows folder. And I'll go to Downloads. So I have a real directory called Downloads, D-Downloads. And in the CompleteFTP file system, it'll be accessible via temp/downloads because I've mounted it under a virtual directory called temp and a directory called downloads. So that's how you add directories to CompleteFTP. Settings. We have the detailed settings that were briefly mentioned in the Standard Edition. They have much more detailed settings. Again, you can enable and disable protocols, but can control things like anonymous logins, and most importantly, security settings and port numbers. So for FTP and FTPS, port 21 is default. Implicit mode is 990. Security settings, you can set the server certificate. You can choose the cipher suite. Quite a few different ciphers are enabled, and you can choose the minimum SSL version. That's all for FTPS. Now for SCP and SFTP, by default SCP is not enabled, we can enable that. SSH terminal access is something useful. If you want to, from a remote machine, be able to SSH into the server, if you enable this protocol, then you can do that. And finally, there's something called SSH forwarding, which is talking about setting up secure SSH tunnels between a client and CompleteFTP. That's something you shouldn't be using unless you are very familiar with what it does. There's also advanced settings there for you can choose the IP addresses to listen on. If you have more than one interface installed, you can select one or more interfaces. Server keys and even the algorithms that are chosen, you can choose to support compression, for example, different ciphers, and so on. Again, these are settings you should not modify unless you're familiar with SFTP and SCP. HTTP and HTTPS, we also have plenty of settings. Public access is enabled by default, so that means you don't need to authenticate to access the public site. CompleteFTP supports something called server-side JavaScript, and it's enabled by default. You can write your own JavaScript programs and run them on the server. And there's a bunch of advanced settings such as the port, IP addresses, server certificate, which is shared with FTPS, and different features such as directory listing templates and so on. File sharing. We've enabled file sharing, and this is supported by our CompleteBox client, which you can install on any machine and use to share files on this server. Oops, let's go down to file system settings. You can block certain file names from being uploaded, allow / operators. Let me just minimize a few of these. And importantly, there's some detailed settings for auto banning. Auto banning is, we mentioned in the standard edition, it can't be controlled in the standard edition. In the professional edition and higher, you can set the number of failures allowed in a period, the counting period, and how long the ban is for. You can also filter on IP addresses, and we've got a fairly sophisticated way of allowing certain IP addresses and ranges, and you can test the rules that are there via the test filter. Again, that's not something you should use unless you are quite familiar with what you're doing. Various timeouts can be set for logging in, stalled transfers, and idled sessions, and so on. And finally, in the messages, you have a welcome message, and you can hide the server product details so that users aren't aware of what server it actually is. So that's the settings. Users and folders are the same as in the standard edition. We have groups. You can group users into various groups, and that's useful when you get to permissions. You can give owner, group, and user permissions to CompleteFTP folders. You can select all kinds of different settings there. And also Windows permissions also apply for actual files on the system. So non-Windows permission access applies to the CompleteFTP directory structure, but for actual files it uses the Windows permissions. Well, monitoring and admin access are as in the standard edition, and same for licensing. But events is an important new capability in the professional edition and higher. Process triggers. You can enable a process when an event occurs on the server. For example, new process trigger. Every time a file is uploaded, I can run a program, a batch script, a PowerShell script, or what's called an FTP script. I can set filters so it's only triggered for certain file uploads, and so on. And there's a lot of different events here. Downloading files, deleting, moving files, and so on. So when someone uploads a file, you can trigger a process that will copy that file somewhere else, or even FTP that file somewhere else. We also have what's called scheduled events, and these are a bit like cron. If I start it up, we can set on a particular schedule, time intervals, days of the week, and by a cron expression, events to trigger. So a program, a batch script, and so on can be triggered once an hour, or once a minute, or once on a Friday at 10 PM, or something like that. So they're process triggers. We can also do email notifications that are similar. Enter in the details of your SMTP server, username and password, add an event, a notification, and every time a file is uploaded, you can be notified of that file being uploaded. An email will be sent to someone, whoever you actually specify. And finally, the Professional Edition supports auditing. If you switch auditing on, it's off by default, then there's a comprehensive audit log which contains logins, logouts, and file transfers and renames and things like that, so you can keep track of what's going on your server. Monitoring is the same, and as we've said, all the others are the same. So that completes the overview of the Professional Edition of CompleteFTP. Events and groups are probably the most important extra feature as well as these new protocols.